Okay, welcome scholars to chapter 2 of um, the American Government in Black and White, Diversity and Democracy. This chapter is on the Constitution, rights and race intertwined. As we go through the lecture, please be mindful again to make sure you're reading your the chapter. It's important you read the chapter because I'm not going over the entire chapter. If I did, you'd probably be sitting here for 3 hours. So I'm gonna start with the lecture, and at the end, I'll remind you again to please, 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 please read the chapter. Okay, thank you. So the Constitution, Rights and Race Intertwined, Chapter 2. James Madison said in 1788, if men were angels, then no government would be needed. And I want you to just really digest that. What is James Madison trying to say? If men were angels, then no government would be needed. And I have my thoughts, and I believe he's trying to say if men were perfect, because we have this idea of angels being perfect, then we wouldn't need government because people would just do the right thing. And to enrich ourselves. And we've seen it, and we see it all over. We see it all the time. Just recently, you're seeing Afghanistan, where the former president left, and they say when he left on the private jet when he was leaving, he had over 100 and maybe $30 million. I mean, just imagine. Anyway, and so he was in really going on, right? So we're going to find out what was really going on in the colonies, as George Washington and the our forefathers led the revolution to their independence and their freedom. And so as we begin, we're going to talk about the road to revolution between 1739 and 1763. Great Britain had engaged in very costly wars, and it is true, mostly with France, but with many different. There was the 100 Years' War, there was the 7 Years' War, the 7 Years' War in Europe was really the American Indian War here in America. And so Great Britain would use the colonies to enrich it, to keep the coffers, the treasury, full in order to fight wars. The British Parliament worked to generate more revenue from the colonies to cover the nation's debt. And the problem with a lot of that had to do with the fact that the colonists didn't have representation in Parliament. And we see that today in places like Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, Washington, D.C. People are getting taxed but have no representation. And so it's kind of like the American way to fight for your rights, kind of, right? And as we begin on this road, we start seeing these acts and when we talk about acts, we're talking about taxes. And we all know how Americans love their taxes. Like the American Revenue Act, which was the Sugar Act. And what they did was they taxed not just sugar, but tea. And you got to remember, tea is a big deal within the British system and in the English way of life. There's high noon tea, and also the coffee and wine. And so all these things were being taxed. And then you would with that, and that was in 1764. Well, then in 1765, you have the Stamp Act, which any document, deed, or anything had to be signed, had to have a notary, what we call a notary public, where the person had to do the stamp, and they were being taxed for that. And that was a big deal because when you see this type of behavior, or you see this type of, when you see these things happening when the government taxes you today, you get upset. And when the Stamp Act happened, and when people in those days would sit there and shake hands, and they would tell each other, your word, my word is my bond, and people would shake on it. Well, now the government's saying you got to have a document. And so if part of your culture is to your word being your bond, and now you have to have a document, then you would get pushback from the people. The Courting Act of 1965, so they had two, where they had to supply the British troops with housing. So if a British troop came to your house, you had to let them stay, let them come in and stay. Then you have the Declaratory Act of 1766, the Townshend, and the Declaratory Act basically was Parliament having the final say, so being the supreme authority. The Townshend Acts of 1776, you have the Tea Act of 1773, and remember now the Sugar Act, the tea was already raised in 1764, so now it's raised again in 1773. At this point, it upsets the colonists. The colonists want to declare independence. They had the first Continental Congress, which Georgia did not show up. And the reason why Georgia did not show up was because there was a bit of an issue with the Native Americans. They were getting ready for war against the Native Americans. You got to remember, the colonies were separate. So it was like being in separate countries. They were not unified, even though they were under the Articles of Confederation. It still didn't help. It wasn't helpful because you didn't have a continental army where all 13 colonies came together and had an army to protect themselves and each other. In 1776, you have the Second Continental Congress. This time, Georgia shows up, so you had all 13. They raised an army against the British, but did not yet declare independence yet. And that they fell short of doing that at that point. And so that's something to remember. The Declaration of Independence, the combination of war with Britain and increasingly widespread familiarity with classical liberal, classical Republican theories led to the increased calls for independence from Britain. Remember in the first chapter, we kind of went over what classical liberal and classical liberal Republican, what that is, Hobbes and Locke and those guys. And so there's this, Thomas Paine put out this like a pamphlet called The Common Sense. And the Common Sense really pushed for this idea of independence. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress appointed a committee to draft the Declaration of Independence. July 4th, 1776, the Second Continental Congress officially announces Declaration of Independence. So as you start seeing now, and so what really causes this is this idea of not being represented, having representation in Parliament. And it's hard, and it is hard. Just think about it. Just think if you're 5,000, 10,000 miles away from people who are making decisions for you. And we can argue that here in California, if we didn't have Sacramento, if you didn't have your local governments, if you didn't have your county or your city governments, and you only had this centralized entity in Washington, D.C., Californians would be pretty upset. And especially if they had no representation in that Congress, and we're being taxed and we're paying a majority of the taxes. You know, it will make you feel a certain way and not want to participate or become independent of that entity. The first attempt at the national government, you get the Articles of Confederation, a limited national government. The original founders were concerned about the unitary form of government. They opted for a confederation. So in the beginning, they didn't want a strong central government. What the Articles pushed for was this confederation and perpetual union, but it was a unicameral form of government with limited powers. So when we talk about the Articles of Confederation, it's this entity that didn't have a lot of power. Okay, most of the powers were within the colonies themselves, and so the colonies had a lot of the powers. They could raise an army within the Articles of Confederation, but they couldn't tax. So how are you going to pay your army I have an army, but how do I pay the army, right? Then you have what you find with the Articles of Confederation. It's very weak. And Shays' Rebellion in 1786 and 1787 was a rebellion led by farmers, led by a Captain Shay. They were frustrated and angry that, again, when farmers are people feeding the people, but yet they're not getting their fair share. So what that shows in the Articles of Confederation is a weakness. And the Congress could authorize an army to aid Massachusetts that could not raise the revenue, just like I just said a couple of minutes ago, that Congress, it's easy to raise an army, but can you pay them? People don't show up when you don't pay them. Again, in 2021, Afghanistan falls because you find out that the government in Kabul wasn't paying the military. They hadn't been paid in 6 months. So when the Taliban rolls in, they give up the guns. They're like, I'm not being paid, but the Taliban is offering money. So then they decide the altering of the articles required unanimous consent of all 13 states. That was a bit detrimental because that meant every state had a veto. So all it takes is just one out of the 13 to veto anything. So all you need is one to feel like they're not getting their just due. So when they do the second attempt at a national government in 1787, they decide to revise the Articles of Confederation. And what they did is they called a convention in Philadelphia. There was 3 things that happened at this convention. George Washington presided over the sessions, so he became the president. These sessions were held in secret, which was can be a good thing, can be a bad thing. The problem being most of the people there were what we call in 2021 one percenters. So you have these individuals. So where are your poorer classes? So who's representing the people? Are they really represented? And that's just something you got to take into account. And if you read the Constitution, especially in the early days, you had to be white, male, and a landowner. Now think about that: white, male, landowner. So if you're white, okay, you're male, okay, but you don't own any land. So majority of the people in the early colonies had no right to vote. Then they had a second attempt. During the second attempt, you have the Great Compromise. So during the first one, they couldn't agree on anything because you have large states, small states. So the Virginia plan favored the larger states. The New Jersey plan favored the smaller states. So that's where so when you look at that, that's when you get from a unicameral legislator to a bicameral. So that means it's 2 houses. And the House of Representatives is much more of a Virginia plan idea. And the US Senate is a New Jersey plan idea, because it's the smaller states. And if we look in today, California has over 40 million people. You have some states like Wyoming, North and South Carolina, Dakota, that between those 3 states, they have a smaller population than Los Angeles, definitely the county of Los Angeles, but yeah, those 3 states have 6 US. So this is why you get the House of Representatives, because they're not supposed to balance it all out. And there's some good things and some bad things that comes with the idea of bicameral, having 2 houses. With the Great Compromise, there was still a question regarding how states' populations would be counted for the representation in the House, and this had to do with slavery, the enslavement of the African people. They could, if they're not. So how these people were not considered people, but yet this is where you get this idea of 3/5 of a person, because they were considered people for the sake of places like Virginia, because Virginia would not have been considered a large state population-wise, like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York, had it not been for the enslaved Africans that they counted as 3/5 of a person. Now, remember, the enslaved Africans still had no right to vote. They had no right, they had no rights at all, but they were counted for the sake of Virginia, larger, like a state like Virginia having more people in the House of Representatives. When we talk about 3/5 of compromise, it's significantly increased the political power of the South. If you look at the Southern states, not only did it allow a count of 3/5 of their slave population for representation in the House, they would, if they had not done that, they would have gotten fewer House seats. So they would have got 33 instead of 47. So that matters. That really does matter, especially in a place like the House of Representatives. It also matters in the sense of, political parties. And even back then, you start seeing the forming of political parties. You have a debate over ratification, September 17th, 1787. Convention forwarded the draft of the Constitution to the Continental Congress to pass it to the states. All they needed was approval from 3/4. Now, you notice in the articles, every state had a veto power. Now, this changes in the Constitution. They were saying 3/4 of the states for ratification, because they didn't want one state, Rhode Island or Georgia, to pigeonhole or stop this idea. You do have a reaction. You have to the Constitution. You have proponents of it, which are Federalists. And then you have opponents of it, which are anti-Federalists. The Federalists tend to want a strong central government. And usually the Federalists were people that were like John Adams. John Adams was a Federalist. Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist. People from the North tend to be more Federalist. And that scared people from Southern states because they knew Northerners, because you did have abolitionists in the North who were fighting for the emancipation, even as far back as the beginning of America. You do have these people. Now, abolitionism doesn't become a much bigger deal as we get closer to the Civil War, but it was still happening. Okay, anti-Federalists were Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were the anti-Federalists. And James Madison writes articles in favor of the Federalists, because people back in those days that's how they did things. They would, even though you didn't agree, you knew how to argue the other side of an issue. We got to start doing that again, knowing how to argue to both sides of an issue, even if you don't agree with it. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. There were initially 12 amendments, but only 10 were ratified. The ratification happened in 1791. It primarily focused on civil liberties and basic rights. So basically what those are, the 10 amendments are things government can't do to you, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, which are part of the first one, bear arms, quartering soldiers, all that stuff is things that protect you from government forcing people into doing things to you. Now, as that's all I have for this lecture. Please read chapter 2 of your textbook. And that's it. I want you guys to have a great week, and I will see you next week for chapter 3. Bye-bye.